Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Grace Lutheran Podcast. This is Pastor Matt Nupel. Thank you for tuning into our program today as we discuss the month of June celebration of Pride Month. And as always, if you're living in the Winston-Salem or Paughtown area and you're looking for a church that offers weekly Holy Communion and Christ-centered traditional worship, you are always invited to join us every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. at 3410 Community Church Road in Paughtown. So I'm currently recording today's episode on June 5th, which means we are in the full swing of Pride Month in the U.S. I'm sure we've already seen countless examples of the LGBTQ community promoting their worldview and beliefs through all kinds of rainbow flag promotions on social media, through commercials, during parades. And obviously, I'm not the first Christian pastor to make comments about our country's annual celebration of Pride Month. But today, I wanted to focus on something more specific than homosexuality or transsexuality. Something that doesn't seem to get nearly as much attention when Christians talk about Pride Month. I touched on this briefly in our Pentecost sermon yesterday. But ever since last year's Pride Month, I can't help but notice a surprising, almost familiar feeling when I hear a lot of proponents of the LGBTQ community talk about why they feel so strongly about what they believe and why they want to promote it to the world. So for those who weren't a part of our service yesterday, I thought a good place to start would be with the story that I shared about the elementary school teacher out in Austin, Texas. Now, for the sake of fairness, this story is a few months old, but I think it's the perfect example of what I like to call the new evangelical fundamentalism. And we're going to talk a lot more today about what that means. So to make a much longer story as short as I possibly can, apparently there is an elementary school in Austin, Texas that hosted two big events for their elementary school students every spring: the Pride March and the Wellness Walk. The Pride March was, of course, a celebration of the LGBTQ community. It was rainbow flag themed. But the Wellness Walk was a completely separate event that celebrated fitness, wellness, walking long distances, exercise, things like that. Now, I'm not sure what the details are surrounding this, but at some point the administration decided to combine these two events into one event, to have a Pride-themed wellness walk. While I can imagine this was probably done for practical reasons like timing or finances, this did not sit well with some of the faculty of this school. And one teacher in particular wrote a letter to the administration complaining that they had combined these two events. I want us to pay careful attention to what she says and how she says it, but this is what she wrote to her administration. I feel that it is inappropriate to call our parade this morning a wellness walk at all. While I understand that wellness walk is something that was previously in motion to promote health and fitness and is something we want to continue, it really takes away from the experience of celebrating pride to couple the two. Now pay attention, because this is where it gets interesting. It is not enough to just welcome, love, and celebrate queer people. Your allyship should always lead you to activism, speaking up and fighting for what is right, even when it feels uncomfortable. We cannot choose in and out of our protest spaces. Now, she continues on to say a lot more than that, but for the purpose of this episode, I just want to focus on what she's already said. Listen to how she describes her strongly held worldview and how she expects other people to accept that worldview. It is not enough, she says, for you to love a person who is queer. It is not enough to be welcoming to a gay person or to accept a transgender person. But according to this teacher, you must be an activist. You must be somebody who agrees with what I call good and right, and you must prove your worth by doing the same things that I'm doing. In other words, we could say this teacher believes she has an important message. A message of gay activism, of sexual fulfillment, of celebrating pride, whatever she chooses to define that message as. But she has an important message that she wants to promote and share with other people in such a way that they come to believe and act exactly as she believes and acts. Now, in framing it this way, what does all of this sound really, really similar to? And for Christians, I think it's pretty obvious that this sounds a lot like how we speak about the gospel, the good news or the good message that we want to promote and preach to other people in a way that they come to believe in Jesus Christ and act on those beliefs in a way that they can live in accordance with God's will. This is why I believe it's appropriate to call the emerging popularity of this worldview the new evangelical fundamentalism. Because as we've seen from this teacher, and as I'm sure we've seen from many other people like this teacher, there is something deeply evangelical about the promotion of these ideas within this culture. They have a message of what they call good news that they want to preach and promote to the world in a way that they create more activists or converts. And in much the same way that Christians describe the gospel, this good news of many of these pride activists must completely transform a person's life. They are not allowed to think the things that they previously thought. They're not allowed to live the way that they previously lived. But their life must be consumed by this good news. After all, as the teacher said, we can't choose in and out of our protest spaces. Okay, so why does all of this matter? Well, I believe it's important for us to frame Pride Month for what it really is. It's the desperately needed expression of religious zeal in a largely non-religious society. In other words, the majority of Americans have chosen to ignore our human need for worship and community-based fundamental principles. We were told church was oppressive and unnecessary to understand the world, so many people left and never came back. But now, we have an entire country of folks who still have this deep human need for conformity and religious fervor. So where do they find their outlet? Where do they express their passion and need for identity? In the one thing that looks and functions like a religion, but doesn't call itself a religion. And that, for our purposes today, is LGBTQ activism. If you're an LGBTQ activist, you can still be preachy to people. You can still impose a moral code of right and wrong on other people. And you can even bend the rules a little because you're doing it for a good cause. All while denying that there's anything religious about your behavior. This brings us to the fundamentalist part of the new evangelical fundamentalism. We can see how this new religion is evangelical in its intent, but how is it fundamentalist? After growing up in the Bible Belt, when I think of fundamentalism, even as a Christian, I get a couple of red flags that go up in my mind. Because typically fundamentalism means that it is completely exclusive in its view of God, the Bible, of Jesus Christ, in a way that if you don't believe exactly what we do, then you aren't one of us. So to use myself as an example, I'm a Lutheran Christian minister, but I would not consider myself a Lutheran fundamentalist because I believe people such as Baptists, Methodists, Anglicans, all these other denominations, I believe that they are also Christians, even though they aren't Lutheran. On the other hand, if you come across somebody who is, for example, a Baptist fundamentalist, then the chances are that in some way they don't believe that you are a true Christian or a serious Christian unless you are a Baptist in the same way that they are. I'm saying all this because I'm not trying to set up a good guy versus bad guy kind of thing. I'm not saying that there are the good Christian fundamentalists on this side and the bad LGBTQ fundamentalists on the other side. I have strong concerns with fundamentalism in general, but it is interesting that today we're seeing a very similar kind of fundamentalism within Pride Month that we previously saw within Christian fundamentalism only about 20 to 30 years ago. For those who may have been around back then, think for a moment about the negative attitudes that people often associate with Christian fundamentalists in this country. Christian fundamentalists, as they're called, are often seen as imposing Christian beliefs on others who may or may not be Christian, They don't associate, or at least they distance themselves from those who aren't one of them. They have a strong need to express their beliefs to others, even if it breaks their rules about proselytizing, because they believe it's the right thing to do. And finally, when it comes to your personal opinions on politics, on sex, or religion, Christian fundamentalists are often accused of wanting to make that their business, all under the guise of wanting what's best for you. Christian fundamentalism is accused of being controlling because it tries to dictate how non-Christians ought to live and think, usually attempting to do this through political influence, through voting, and influencing the media. So my question is, how much different is this from what we're seeing during Pride Month? First, a lot of LGBTQ activists, like the Austin teacher, have openly admitted their desire to impose their views about sexuality onto those who don't agree with them. Second, I've seen many self-proclaimed activists who refuse to have any close friends who disagree with them politically. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this example. If you don't agree with me on gay marriage, or gendered pronouns, or transgenderism, then go ahead and unfriend me on social media because I don't want to be your friend. While I'm sure the same can be said for a lot of conservative voices, we can see a strong exclusivism within fundamentalism, whether it be Christian fundamentalism or LGBTQ activist fundamentalism. Third, if you don't see how LGBTQ activists have a zealous need to proselytize their views this month, then I don't know how else to say this, but you just aren't paying attention. Almost everywhere we look, whether it's online, on TV, or in the real world, has rainbow flags or business promotions that are pride-themed. And while it may not be the majority by any stretch, this year we've already seen several examples of teachers who decided to break the rules of their school administration in order to teach their views on sexuality to their students. And I believe they felt the strong need to do that for the exact same reason that many Christians feel the strong need to break the rules at their work to share the gospel with their coworkers. Because promoting their version of the good news is the greater moral good. And finally, as we've already seen, many LGBTQ activists see it as their responsibility to change your views on politics, sex, or religion, so they need to make those things their business. To give a personal, admittedly story-based example, I once had a friend during my time in the Navy that was an openly gay man, and our friendship came to a collision eventually, because for him, it wasn't enough for me to love him and be his friend and support him in times of need, but according to him, I had to affirm his sexual lifestyle as good and righteous, or else we couldn't be friends. We had many conversations where he would push me with, well, what do you really believe? Well, do you think it's okay if I do this or that? And my question was, and it still is today, if I'm telling you that I love you, if I'm telling you that you are my close friend, that I would even go on double dates with you and your boyfriend, and that I want to spend time with you, why does it matter what my personal opinions are? But again, for him, in order for me to be one of him, or one of the good guys, he needed to make my personal opinions his business. We were not allowed to agree to disagree on how he expressed his sexuality, but I had to affirm every sexual decision he made as morally good. Again, I admit this is just a personal story and it shouldn't count for evidence for anything really. But I have met a lot of people who share my views that have similar experiences. They had a close friend who was gay or lesbian or transgender, and as much as they tried to continue being friends with that person, it just wasn't enough unless they completely turned their worldview around and expressed the same beliefs as they did. So again, I think it's important to bring all of this back to the point of our discussion, so I'm not just venting what I think into the microphone. Why is all of this important? Well, first, as I said before, I believe it's important that we see the religious underpinning of LGBTQ activism, or really any kind of evangelical fundamentalism, because we as human beings are not spiritually neutral. It isn't a coincidence that this new evangelical fundamentalism functions in much the same way as Christian evangelical fundamentalism, because they both meet the deep human need for worship, for conformity, and for active evangelism. Second, because we already know what fundamentalism looks like in this country from Christian fundamentalism. We as the church can prepare for what this new evangelical fundamentalism will likely become. Much like Christian evangelical fundamentalism, I predict that there will come a time when much of the LGBTQ activist efforts become centralized into an institution. I predict this will cause a lot more boldness, but unfortunately more hostility from certain LGBTQ activists who want to impose their beliefs on those who don't agree. But the good news is, I also predict there will come a day when enough people with influential voices will put their foots down and say no, causing an exodus from this LGBTQ institution. I absolutely hate to use them as an example, but I can't think of a better equivalent. But much like the new atheists in the early 2000s spoke out against institutionalized religion, which caused a mass exodus from the American church that lasted a little over a decade, I believe we will see an equivalent of angry, fired up, yet influential voices speaking out against this new evangelical fundamentalism, saying, no, I don't believe what you believe, and you can't force that upon me. Or, no, I don't have to do things like buy a rainbow-colored burger or attend a pride march to prove that I don't hate gay people. Or, no, I think what you believe is kind of silly, and I should be allowed to express why on my platform. I'm not sitting here with some kind of prophetic voice. I don't know when these things will happen or how these things will happen. But if my diagnosis is correct, if this new evangelical fundamentalism functions in much the same way as the previous American Christian evangelical fundamentalism, then we should expect that there will eventually be a similar reaction from voices who have the platform to speak out against it. Because now, ironically, it's not the atheists anymore that are crying out, stop shoving your beliefs down my throat. But it's the conservative-minded Christians who are now in the position of wanting out of a broader cultural system that they don't want to be a part of. To finish this episode, I do want to make a really important final point, and that is how we as Christians interact with those who may be a part of the LGBTQ community. It is very easy for us as the church to respond in anger or frustration at a lot of these new evangelical fundamentalist attempts to preach their good news or proselytize their LGBTQ agenda. Sadly, I've already seen numerous Christians post horrible, tasteless jokes on social media directed at gay or transgender people. But church, the LGBTQ community is watching us very closely, and they are waiting for us to trip up and show the world how ignorant, how mean, and how exclusivist we really are. I've already expressed this to Grace from the pulpit, but if Grace were to ever have visitors who were gay or lesbian or transgender, then our goal as the church should ensure that they leave our worship service that Sunday thinking to themselves, wow, I had no idea that conservative-leaning Christians could be so loving, could be so welcoming, could be so full of grace and mercy towards those they don't know. And I strongly believe that that's the attitude that we as Christians should have towards anyone who considers themselves part of the LGBTQ community. When they interact with you, you should want them to walk away having their expectations and preconceived notions about conservative Christians completely blown out of the water. What the church needs now is a strong ethic of loving, and extending the grace of Jesus Christ to those within the LGBTQ community, and a strong ethic of standing firm on what Scripture teaches us about human sexuality. Admittedly, through the course of American Christian history, balancing those two things has been very difficult. Most assemblies end up leaning on one side more than the other side. But as I've said before, Grace Lutheran Church is not every other church. We are not the ELCA that has fully embraced this new evangelical fundamentalism, and we are not the independent fundamentalist Baptist church that says gay people are not allowed in our pews on Sundays. At Grace, I believe we have an opportunity as an assembly to rise above these two extremes that we see so often in the United States and be that unique church that, on one hand, upholds and firmly believes what the Bible teaches us about marriage, about sex and sexual identity, but at the same time is able to express shocking, overwhelming Christ-centered love and mercy to the LGBTQ community, to be the hands and feet of Jesus Christ, who loves them so much that he died for them, and would stoop down and wash the dirt off their filthy feet. You'll meet a lot of people, whether they're Christian or LGBTQ, who will say that this balance is impossible. You can't logically do both. But what I say is that those people have not met Grace Lutheran Church, and they severely underestimate what the Lord can equip us to do. I think that'll be a good place for us to stop for this episode. I want to thank you again for tuning into our program today. I know this can be a very controversial topic, so my hope is that I was able to express my ideas clearly, with charity, and in a way that also upholds the truth of God's Word. For those who don't know, I'm getting married in a few days, so I will be gone for about 2 weeks on my honeymoon. But in the meantime, I pray that you all continue to be blessed by our content, and may the peace of God, which passes all understanding, guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.